This is Lake Effect from Milwaukee Public Radio. I'm Bonnie North. Thanks for joining us today. In the past few decades, invasive species have become a growing problem around the world. These plants or animals interrupt or take over ecosystems, threatening, crowding out, and sometimes even completely destroying native species. Here in Wisconsin, two of the most well-known culprits in Lake Michigan are the zebra mussel and the Asian carp. But in urban areas like Milwaukee, there are many invasives, mostly plants, that fly under the radar. This has left both residential areas and public parks vulnerable. Lake Effect's Kirsten Wisniewski takes us to one county park in Franklin that faces huge struggles with invasive species.
The Ware Nature Center is part of the Milwaukee County Park System, but it's not your typical recreational park. It emphasizes education, and while it lacks a frisbee golf course, it does feature half a dozen trails and habitats ranging from wetlands to prairies for visitors to explore. According to Mark Verhagen, Natural Areas Management Specialist, Ware is also home to many different invasive species.
Invasive exotic species here that end up doing very well are ones that grow very quickly. They produce a lot of seed. They're sort of not always early successional, but they're ones that aren't very long-lived generally. That probably is the biggest factor. They have the ability to spread quickly, and that's really what causes a lot of that kind of stuff.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the more common invasive species that people in an urban environment are going to come in contact with, especially when it comes to plants that may be growing in their own backyard that they may not be aware of?
Well, actually, garlic mustard is probably the biggest one. That's one that's found throughout the city. A lot of people do have it in their yard and are not aware of it. That's probably the biggest one, and that's an easy one, since it's very easy to recognize and identify. It's not very easy to control, but at least it's fairly easy to have someone understand what the problem is. But there's that one, and then there's Dame's rocket could be one of them, otherwise known as sweet rocket. That's another mustard. It's usually found in places where garlic mustard is found. They both like sort of a shadier environment, and they generally can't handle too much sunlight. Like in the open sunlight, they don't do very well in. So those two are definitely found in the city for sure. As far as plants go, well, buckthorn can be a problem. If somebody has a big enough yard that has maybe even just a small area that's naturalized, not any lawn really, and doesn't get mowed, buckthorn can show up. And that's a shrub that is spread by birds. And so they spread around buckthorn all over the place. In fact, if you notice where buckthorn is, a lot of times it's underneath a large tree with limbs that birds would sit in. And you'll see little buckthorns growing under that usually. But those three things are the biggest ones for the actual real part of the city.
And are these the same types of species that are challenging parks as well, or things like a nature center? Are you guys experiencing the same problems that private homeowners are experiencing, or do you guys have a collection of other species that you're dealing with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because since I work for UW Extension, but this is a Milwaukee County Parks facility, so I'm contracted to them. So I sort of deal with both ends, and at the Nature Center, we do have a huge range of invasive exotic species. In fact, the land here that I manage is probably the worst infested land for invasive exotic species I've ever seen. It's amazing. I made a list and a timeline for all these things for when they flower, and I think we're up to 17 species, I think now, of recognized invasive exotic species. So most homeowners would never deal with that, and that's they might deal with like one or two things, and that's about it.
While the Ware Center deals with a lot of invasives, garlic mustard poses one of the biggest challenges. It is widely recognized as incredibly difficult to get rid of. But Verhagen explains how, through what seems to be a happy accident, the garlic mustard population at Ware is being controlled.
We noticed that there was some feeding on garlic mustard to the point where it reduced the population in certain spots very heavily. And in a lot of those spots, we didn't have to do anything. And we noticed those plants that were being chewed on weren't even really producing any seed. So we thought that that the biological control beetles that are being researched to help control garlic mustard, someone may have actually taken those beetles from a test plot in our area, and released them out here. And I'm not sure that's the case. It's just a suspicion at this point, but I don't have any other explanation about why our garlic mustard is doing that. But now we didn't even do much garlic mustard control this year, and that's amazing, because that was our main thing in the spring, was to pull garlic mustard. And I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. Normally, when you have biological control beetles like that, or some other agent, you want to release it in a certain way and sort of keep track of it and control it. So we can't really do that.
Well, when you're using something like a biological control, do you ever run the risk of it turning into an invasive species itself?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest concerns about doing this. In fact, that's why they do the research ahead of time. And with garlic mustard beetles, they've been doing the research for, I think, over 8 years now. And, in the case of like the loosestrife beetles, they did it for about 7 or 8 years. And that's a pretty good long time. And people are pretty convinced that they've done a fairly good job. They actually introduce these exotic beetles or whatever it is onto the plants that are native here. They do it all in a greenhouse, in a lab. And they figure out if any of these beetles will eat any of our native plants, and if they'll become a problem on those. And so those insects have to pass all those tests.
For public entities like parks and nature centers, it's a balancing act between managing invasives with other priorities, given their limited resources. To make it even more challenging, Verhagen says that some of the management methods that are most effective could also be very expensive. At this time, parks don't have many resources to spare, and Verhagen says he doesn't see them getting extra funding for invasive management in the near future.
Usually when things are economically depressed, things like invasive exotic species are the first thing to go. They're important, but they're not really important, Yeah. And it's kind of unfortunate, because it's the sort of thing, if you do take care of early, and you can save yourself a lot of money and headache in the long run. And, governments generally don't think like that, though.
The Wisconsin legislature, however, has taken some action against invasive plants. They passed NR 40, a law that regulates the plants that are available in nurseries and garden centers in an effort to stem the spread of potentially harmful species. Verhagen explains the impact of the law.
That's going to help a lot with awareness, not just people going out and enforcing laws or anything like that, which they're probably going to do to some extent, but in the fact that some of these things they have in their yard and can buy at a nursery are terrible. In fact, many of the plants that are being sold at nurseries are going to be invasive exotic plants in the future, really nasty ones. But we don't do anything about that. And we really should, If you think about it, that would save us a lot of time and money.
NR 40 targets a lot of plants, but there are plenty of non-plant species causing problems in natural areas throughout our region. One species is so incredibly common that most people don't know that it's invasive. Earthworms, considered helpful in gardens, have actually been damaging forests in the Midwest.
As far as earthworms go, it's not a real obvious problem. It can be if you're shown what it looks like. But if you actually see like a front of earthworms and what they do, they eliminate a whole bunch of species. They pretty much eat the layer of humus, or it's that rotting, litter layer. They actually consume that whole thing right down to the soil. So basically, in earthworm areas, there really isn't a litter layer. It just gets wiped out. And there's a lot of our plants, native plants, that depend on that layer in order to germinate and grow. So those plants get excluded. And a lot of people don't know that earthworms in glaciated areas anywhere, not just Wisconsin, didn't have earthworms after glaciation. They didn't exist. All those worms that you see were all introduced, every single one of them. In fact, people who fish a lot, and I fish myself, when you use worms, it's a good idea to dispose of them and in a way so that they're not going to be able to escape into the wild. And that's a good message to get across to people, because just doing that will at least stop the spread. Because earthworms don't, by themselves, once they're in the wild, it takes them a long time to move. So when they get introduced to an area, it's probably from somebody who dumped some worms somewhere. And that's how it happens. So just getting people to stop doing that would be a huge step in trying to fix that.
Verhagen encourages people to talk to their neighbors about what's going on in their yards and to get involved with management efforts in their local parks. He says spreading awareness is key to fighting the spread of invasive species. For Lake Effect, I'm Kirsten Wisniewski.